Good morning, Sitaram, and welcome to another program in the series Addiction and Recovery. I'm your host, Ramnaresh Dwarika, as usual, on a Thursday morning at 9, welcoming all of our brothers and sisters, whether in Trinidad and Tobago, of the Caribbean, or worldwide, on the various media platforms who are listening to this program, and to remind you that this program is being recorded and it will be posted on Facebook and YouTube soon after its completion this morning. It will also be repeated on radio and TV Jagriti at 10 p.m. tonight. So those of you who are unable to follow the program in its entirety at this point in time, you can always come back to it later on the radio and TV, or you can go back to YouTube or Facebook, and you can also post your comments or remarks there. If you have questions, you can also raise it and I'll try to answer them. And I have my numbers on the screen, 671-3040 or 768-5925. You can call these numbers after the program if you have any questions. Today I have a very, very important program in store for you all. And, this is something that has been contentious for a while. And it is, today I want to talk about the science behind the 12 steps. Why AA works in addiction and recovery. Because a lot of people out there who are not familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, that is AA, they're still, amazed how it works. And some of them have serious questions about the methodology. A lot of people have questions about what is this 12 steps they talk about. So I'm going to be talking about that this morning. And I'm going to explore this whole question of why Alcoholics Anonymous works when other treatment intervention methods fail. And then that contentious issue is Alcoholics Anonymous just a spiritual philosophy, or is there real science behind it? And that's really the, the important aspect of the program here this morning. What is the science behind these 12 steps that AA use that makes Alcoholics Anonymous work? Because Alcoholics Anonymous has helped millions of people worldwide recover from alcoholism and drug addiction, because it is now being used by Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, the very same 12 steps. And yet critics often say it's outdated, it is unscientific, or it is too spiritual, you know? So in this program, we will examine what addiction science tells us about the brain, how the 12 steps align with modern psychology and neuroscience, why humility, honesty, connection, and service are powerful healing tools, and why AA remains one of the most effective long-term recovery models. Now, AA can be found in almost every country of the world today. The Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book text that they use as the Bible in AA is translated into almost 70 different languages. And it is being used in various treatment modalities and treatment facilities. Indeed, at Cora Hospital, where I worked, and at St. Anne's Hospital, that housed the alcohol treatment centers, you had and continue to have Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at those centers once a week, so that people in recovery who were admitted to those programs, they can get a first-hand view of what Alcoholics Anonymous is all about and so on, from actually listening to AA members speak about their experience with the 12-step program. Now, AA is very scientific, and as me being a social scientist myself, trained in human and human growth and development, in psychology and psychotherapy. I have looked at the 12-step program from a scientific point of view, and I want to say today that this is AA stands up to scientific scrutiny. This is science explained in plain language today. This is not opinion. So that addiction, I want to look at first addiction as a brain disease. Let's begin with what science agrees on today. And that is, addiction is a chronic brain disorder and not a moral failure. And that is very important to understand that, because once a person has become addicted, it's not a question of willpower, as I will discuss later on, or it's not a question of habit or choice. It is labeled in the DSM-5 and the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that is used in the psychiatric health services, that alcoholism is a disease. It's not a bad habit. It is not a question of being weak-willed or deviant, but it is accepted now by the World Health Authority, the Pan American Health Association, even our Ministry of Health, accept that alcoholism and drug addiction is a disease and not a moral failure. It is a chronic brain disorder. So that modern neuroscience shows that prolonged substance use alters the brain's reward system. It also weakens the prefrontal cortex, that is the part of the brain that controls judgment and impulses. And if we pause there a second, and if your judgment and your ability to manage impulses becomes impaired, then one will quickly understand why a person who is a chronic addict or alcoholic is unable to make the right choices, even though they are feeling and experiencing the consequences. So that it also strengthens stress and craving pathways in the limbic system. That is chronic use of drugs and alcohol. It creates new pathways in the limbic system. And this explains why addicts continue using despite consequences. And this is always baffling to people around, relatives and so on. You know, how come this intelligent young man who so educated, who grew up in such a good family who was so, involved in temple and church and all of that, presenting with all the good value system and so on, all of a sudden they are now, stealing to support their habit and lying and all that goes with it. It is very difficult to really understand that. It also explains why willpower alone doesn't work. Because a lot I've heard it said, and I too had it said to me, boy, what happened? And for me, this was really baffling because I always thought I had a will of steel. And growing up as a young man, if I said I'm doing something, I do it. I believed in the saying, better your life go than your promise break. I come from that tradition. But when it came to alcohol, I can't understand what happened with my willpower. And this is also, it explains why relapse is common without structured support. And this is also why, you alone can do it. You alone have to do it, but you can't do it alone. So some of the key points we want to look at is AA begins with the same scientific conclusion. Now, as a therapist, a trained counselor as well, social worker, psychiatric social worker, and that, I know that, a problem is one of definition. And the first line, the first thing that responsibility of a therapist is to help the client, the person in front of them, the patient, to identify what the problem is. Because a lot of times the alcoholic might, and I've had this experience where they say, look, if I just get some more money, I will be able to pay the rent and pay the mortgage and all of that. I need to get a better job. When in truth and in fact, if they stop drinking and wasting away their money and all of that, spending it badly, they would have had enough money to manage to pay the mortgage and pay the rent and pay all of that. But they are not seeing, they're only looking at the presenting problem. So that the counselor, therapist has to help the person to recognize first what is the root problem, the basic problem, and to help them to admit it and accept it. Because until they admit that the drinking is a problem, they will never be able to fix it. So that the first step of AA is just as scientific as what we do in counseling and social work, in that it asks the person to admit that they are powerless over alcohol. And because of that powerlessness, that addiction over time, that dependence, it has made their life unmanageable. So the step reads, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. So there are two parts to it. But the precursor to that step is that the person now has to be helped to develop a certain level of insight in that they could recognize the role the true role alcohol and drugs are playing in their life, and they make the connection between the drug use, the drinking and drug use, and the problems that they are having, how it is causing their life to be unmanageable. And that would be the beginning of a successful intervention. And to admit that one is powerless over alcohol is not a sign of weakness. It is really a very accurate diagnosis. And like in any other field of medicine, for instance, if your diagnosis is not accurate, then your treatment plan will not be relevant and will not work. So that AA matches standard contemporary intervention methods for any problem, whether it be health, whether it be financial. If a person is investing in the wrong stocks, for instance, they will suffer losses. And it is because they are not properly seeking proper guidance and advice from a stockbroker. So in any area of life, if your engine is making noise and it's really because the cylinder head gasket blew, but you keep patching the muffler thinking you will solve the problem, the car will never get fixed. So just like any other problem, you have to have the courage, the honesty, and the assistance, if necessary, to make the correct diagnosis. When you find out what is the problem, it is almost like half the solution is already made. So that is why step one is critical. And in recovery, it is said that is the one step that all alcoholics and drug addicts must take 100%. So that admitting powerless is really ego deflation, because we were all kind of schooled and socialized so that we will become self-sufficient and independent. And to come now and say, look, I can't handle this, especially we Caribbean men, we have been drummed in our heads, we should be able to handle our stories, man. Whether it be domestic problems, financial problems, we don't go begging people to advise us. We are a proud people, so we have very, very large egos in that respect. So that to come and say, look, I can't, this alcohol has me over the barrel, takes a lot of humility. So it takes a lot of honesty to diagnose correctly, but it takes a lot of humility now to admit and accept help. So that psychology calls this ego deflation. And if you look at all the other 11 steps, they are just a continuum on that process of ego deflation that brings you to a level of humility where you are really able to accept your strengths and recognize your weaknesses and shortcomings. It also asks for surrender of maladaptive control. Because if you're doing the same thing the same way, you cannot expect to get a different result. If you're using maladaptive, inappropriate methods to resolve a problem, you have a quarrel, you go and drink. That don't solve it. You might tell yourself, well, I'll get escape from the problem for the time being, but you might come back and create a bigger problem. So what this first step does, it helps the person at first to admit, and with the development of insight, they move from admission to acceptance. And when they accept that they have a problem, then they are now ready to make changes. It is acceptance-based change. So research shows that people change faster and more sustainably when they stop fighting reality and start accepting it. Because in fighting reality, there's a tendency to blame everybody else. No, it's not me, it's not my drinking. It's you all who does stress me out, and you who nag me all the time, or you all who have not been fair to me, and all of you who have been ungrateful, and we blame everybody else to justify our drinking. So denial is the hallmark of addiction. Again, so if we do not take step one, we will continue to be in denial. If we don't admit that we are powerless over alcohol, that our life had become unmanageable, we continue to be in denial. And denial is a very powerful defense mechanism that people use to help them to cope with all kinds of situations. However, AA confronts denial directly. They don't beat around the bush. Look, it is not the wife, it is not the employer, it is not nobody else. It is the alcohol that is the cause of the problem. And it is because you have lost control over your drinking. So that when the ego stops pretending it's in control, the brain becomes open to learning new behaviors. I want to repeat that. When the ego stops pretending it's in control, the brain becomes open to learning new behaviors. And this aligns with acceptance and commitment, which is really ACT therapy. It's a model of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. It also aligns with motivational interviewing and motivational counseling. And it also aligns with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT for short. And people who are in the helping professions will appreciate what I'm saying here, acceptance and commitment therapy, motivational interviewing, and cognitive behavioral therapy. These are all scientific methodology that has been researched and followed and have met with acceptable levels of use. So science confirms acceptance precedes transformation. And that is scientifically confirmed. That the person has to accept before they will become willing to work with the problem and to change. Now, the other contentious issue in AA has been this whole question of a higher power. And I want to look at the whole concept of a higher power, God as we understand him, and neuroplasticity. And let's address the most controversial part of it, a higher power. AA does not define God. It asks members to accept something greater than the addicted self. So I'm very familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous. I've attended a lot of their meetings and so on. I've spoken to a lot of people in recovery. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, you have that freedom to believe in God or not even believe in God. So you have agnostics and atheists. You just asked to believe in something outside of yourself. And now that really makes sense, because by the time a person reaches to Alcoholics Anonymous, to chronic addiction, they would have tried every strategy endogenous to themselves, peculiar to themselves, that is known by them or that they had used in the past. And all of those strategies had failed. So it is really foolhardy to ask that person to go back again and try the same strategies, changing the chaser, changing the blend, changing the geographical changes, changing the friends. None of those work. They tried all of that. Drinking on a full stomach, empty stomach, all kinds of things. And I can relate to that. So that from a scientific standpoint, having a belief in something outside oneself does a few things. It reduces stress and anxiety because now you're not blaming yourself alone and you're not only relying on your own resources, but you are turning to something outside of yourself. A belief in something larger than oneself reduces cortisol. That is the hormone that causes stress. And that has been established in science. It also shifts attention away from craving so that from the time you get the craving, the urges will come. For those people who are in early stages of recovery, they'll tell you, when they stop drinking, you feel like fish out of water. Your mind is only thinking about drinking. But they have found if you talk to someone else outside of yourself, if you pray to God, all of these things, turning away to ask for help for the with the craving, it means that you have recognized what your mind is doing. You're recognizing that what is happening inside of you. You are now in touch with your feelings. And that is important because for alcoholics and drug addicts, we numbed our feelings for years with alcohol. We never allowed ourselves to feel. And we were not in touch with our feelings. But as you stop drinking and you start in recovery, you start becoming aware of it. And so that it is very, very useful and effective to have help from outside, a higher power that interrupts obsessive thinking. And in my particular, I don't only believe, I have come to experience that higher power, and I know it works. So, thirdly, a belief in something outside oneself, a higher power, what it does, it activates neuroplasticity, which is a new way of thinking. In that humility and openness now allows the brain to form new neural pathways. The brain at every stage. I was telling my 81-year-old sister the other day, who had a slight stroke, that even now you can develop new pathways, in the brain. It's just like, if you're going on the highway, you have from Chaguanas, you're going to San Fernando, and they block the highway for some reason. They have to divert the traffic. You have to get to San Fernando. You are going to find a back road. You'll take the old road or some other detour and get to your place. So the body does the same thing. If one nerve is compromised by way of a stroke or anything, or if your frontal cortex has been compromised by this prolonged use of alcohol and drug to numb it, now that you stop drinking, when challenged with a situation, your brain is going to find new ways every day if we keep an open mind. And that's one of the things AA stresses all the time, I can tell you. When you ask how AA works, the answer is in that word how. The H stands for honesty. Once you stop blaming other people and you take responsibility for your problem and realize, hey, I have a problem with alcohol. That look, alcohol is the thing causing the problem in my life. I need to stop. So I'm not going to be experimenting with this again. I know if I drink, what is going to happen because I have now developed sufficient insight into the relationship that alcohol, the role it played in my life. So my mind is not even going to go back in those old pathways. I'm going to look at new ways now how to deal with this situation in front of me without having to take that drink. And that is what neuroplasticity is about. Humility, it takes humility now to keep that open mind. because the worst thing is to think you know it all. If you met a person who think they know it all, you have not met a more difficult person. So that humility and open-mindedness allows the brain to form new neural pathways, new way of thinking and new way of looking at the problem. In neuroscience terms, surrender quiets the default mode network. Now that might sound a little computerish. I'm not all that technical, but when you surrender, you accept. You don't have to reinvent the wheel now, as we say in engineering. You have been through that so many times that you have learned from it now that there's no point in taking that drink. That drink is not going to help. It also increases emotional regulation. It restores hope, which fuels dopamine in healthy ways. And these are all scientifically proven facts. If we go to the temple and we clap and sing and all of that, what has happened? The brain has released a little bit of dopamine. If we win the match and we clap and we celebrate, the brain releases a little bit of dopamine. Now, this is the same thing drugs did on demand. One drink and immediately brain release dopamine. But you would have recognized now that there was a cost factor for that. The immediate gratification. For that immediate gratification, you had to pay a heavy price. So now you have learned that, look, no, I better go and listen to music, find some other way to get me dopamine, get me high. You understand? And hope with time fuels that way of thinking and that experience. And this is why step 2 works. I'll read step 2, which says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, as I said earlier on, yes, step 2 is about believing in a higher power. And which gives you like a fallback, a default point. Now, in addition to that, there is inventory, confession, and emotional regulation. And that is where step 2 and 3 is believing that a higher power can restore you to sanity. And step 3 is turning your will and life over to the care of God as your understanding, right? Which works together. Now, step 4 and 5 are what is sometimes referred to as psychological gold. And it reads, made a searching and fearless moral inventory. And 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Now, these are what people like myself, trained professionals, do all the time. We invite our clients to ventilate. It's called therapeutic ventilation. And you out there listening will know that if you have a problem and you just have somebody you could talk to, just get it off your chest. It produces a certain amount of relief. It is called catharsis, a catharsis, sorry, where you feel that lightness. So that science tells us that unprocessed guilt and shame drive relapse. A lot of people, because they have so much of guilt and shame in that Pandora box over the years for all the people they curse or they abused or they fought with or they stole from or whatever, they carry all of this guilt. And when you can't remember, it is even worse. You can't remember now who you affected because you were in a state of delirium tremens or blackout and so on. That produces more shame and more guilt. There are also secrets increase stress and craving. Because when you have to carry so many secrets, you have to tell lies sometimes because you don't want to admit it. And all of that drive your stress level, which will fuel the craving. Because remember, in the old days, the way you knew how to deal with this is to go and take a drink. So that is what gives root to the craving. Because alcohol in itself don't really taste good. People don't drink it because they love the taste of it. They drink it because of the effect it produces. So that verbal disclosures reduces the amygdala activation, which is that part of the brain that is responsible for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Now, step 5 functions like this. One, it processes trauma, in that you go back now and well, having done step 4, where you made a list of all the positive things about you and the negative attributes. In step 5, now you are really taking responsibility and looking at, separating yourself from the trauma. So you process it, you realize after step 5, you realize, but wait, my anger is one of my biggest problems, or my fear, or my insecurity. You are able to step back and look at yourself. Now, it also functions like psychodynamic therapy. That is, it allows you, step 5 allows you to ventilate. And we know from history, the churches and so on have shown in on certain terms where they have confessionals, the value of confession, where after a lot of people describe after they do step 5, they confess, all the wrongs that they would have done to people and so on. They felt light. They felt a burden lifted from themselves. And it adds to their ability to be humble. They are owning up, you know. They're doing what is called emotional exposure therapy, where you're not feeling ashamed to the extent where you are not willing to deal with what has happened. In other words, you're opening up that closet with all the skeletons in it. So when we name our resentments and fears and harms and all of that, shame loses power. I want to repeat that. When we name our resentments, fears, and harms, shame loses power, emotion regulation improves, and relapse risk decreases. So this is really a lot of people I work with, I realize, even people who attend AA and so on, most of the people who would have relapsed are people who turn away from doing step 4 and step 5, because step 4 and step 5 is really now going deep within and looking at all the garbage that I have been carrying all along. So AA understood this long before brain scans existed. They understood this even before we were aware of all of these various forms of therapy and so on, CBT and ACT and all of that. So that the making amends is really now repairing the damage. All those bridges that we burnt in the past, now we are rebuilding them. And amends and repairing the social brain. What happens is addiction destroys relationships. The brain is a social organ. Human beings, we are social animals. We do not like to live by ourselves. We live in groups. We were born into a primary group, our family. We live in families, we live in communities and so on. And the brain develops similarly as a social organ. So that step 8 and 9 focus on repair. So in step 1, we recognize the problem, we admit it, accepted, we turn to something outside of us because everything inside didn't work. And now we have stepped back and taken stock. Like if you have a business, the business busts down, you have to now step back and get help and you take stock. What was my bad and irretrievable debts and what I should invest in, what I need to pay attention to, my behavior, my anger, my jealousy, my insecurity, and so on, that led me to get into trouble. So step 8 and 9 is about going back now and having recognized all of those things, becoming willing to make amends. We made a list of all the persons we had harmed. We became willing to have God remove all these defects of character. We humbly ask our higher power to help us. And in step 8 and 9, we start repairing, putting it into action. Now, science shows that social connection is the strongest predictor of long-term recovery. In other words, those people who can reestablish their connections, get rid of their guilt, start to repair that network of relationships at home, on the job, in their communities, those people stand a better chance of sustaining their long-term recovery. Guilt and unresolved harm always activates stress circuits. And I mean, that is common sense. Whenever you're feeling guilty or you're feeling stressed out, you really can't think straight. So that repairing relationships restores emotional safety. And that is what a lot of people need in recovery. They need to be able to have emotional support. In Oftentimes, addiction is referred to as emotional illness. And this results from damaging our relationships, you know. So that making amends, what it does, it reduces chronic stress. So like when I made amends, before that, there was a particular neighbor who, we had an altercation over something. And whenever he was coming, one of us would have to choose to cross the road because we didn't want to cross paths with each other. After making the amends, that changed. So it also restores dignity when you can look someone in the eye and say, look, I'm sorry for what I did. I'm really sorry. And it also acts as something that will prevent you from repeating that behavior in the future. And this is why it is suggested that you make direct amends. I mean, so far as is possible. If somebody is living in Canada and far away and you can use a phone, but now you have phone where you can actually see the person, and so you can actually make eye contact so that they can see that you are really sorry for what you did. And as I say that, you only require to clean your side of the street. It doesn't matter whether the other person provoked the situation. It's up to them to clean their side of the street. You need to take responsibility for where you went wrong. So that it also rebuilds trust, both outward and inward. You begin to be at more peace with yourself and with the people around you when you're able to do this. And you don't chalk up more and more enemies now that you stop drinking. Even though people stop drinking, they may still get into conflict and all of that. But in the program, you learn not to put it off, immediately. That is why step 10 says we continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. Don't put it off. Because once you put it off, it becomes, like an obsession. It becomes a resentment. Anger turns into resentment when you put it off. So that it's important to deal with these things immediately. Now, This is not punishment. Making amends is not punishment. So that, again, I would suggest from experience, anyone out there who thinking about making amends, it's best to have a sponsor, somebody with experience. Because if you go too early, you might get into a bigger quarrel with the person because some people are still hurting over what you did to them. And they may choose the opportunity to, abuse you and insult you and so on. And you not being, spiritually ready for that, you may respond, react rather than respond. And I spoke about that on the last occasion. So that this is a daily thing, daily maintenance and of these steps. It acts as relapse prevention. Step 10, 11, and 12 focus on maintaining your sobriety. Now that you have discovered your strengths and weaknesses, you have identified your defects of character, you have identified those people you would have hurt and harmed, you've become willing to make amends, you have gone ahead and made your amends to them, tell them you're sorry if you were owing the shopkeeper, you're paying back his money and all of that. And now you step 10 is when you continue now to maintain that. You try to avoid doing anything wrong. And I add to that, if you get a chance to do any good, you do it. Don't put it off as well. Because now people don't only want to hear that you stop drinking, they want to see. You can't be, you stop drinking and using drugs and still behaving the same way like when you were using, then it wouldn't have made any difference, you know? So addiction is chronic and recovery must be daily. I want to say that again. Addiction is a chronic condition. Once you become addicted, you can't go back to being non-addicted. Once you cross that compulsory borderline from social to uncontrollable drinking, you can't go back to social drinking. So you have to, it's a daily reprieve you get by avoiding the first drink one day at a time and doing all the other things that the step require. Now, these steps involve self-monitoring, that is, paying attention to what is going on in your mind, because that's where the action originate from, your thoughts. So become aware of your thoughts. And if you're thinking of getting even with someone, taking revenge, you know, catch it right there before you actually translate it into action and get yourself into trouble. And that still happens with me. You understand? I'll be, I come back and I say, well, I'm sorry. And the person will say, how many times you will say sorry? And you go back and do the same thing. So self-monitoring is important. If you could look at ourselves before we actually go and do shoot out of our mouth and that kind of thing. And what also helps with that is mindfulness. Mindfulness helps us to become aware of how our mind is working because our mind could be our best friend, but our mind could have been our worst enemy in the past, especially our ego-driven mind. So mindfulness, meditation, these things help us to be able to look at our minds and see and pick it up when our minds is taking us down roads that we don't want to go. And becoming involved in service to others as required by step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we carry this message, we practice these principles in all our affairs, and we try to help other alcoholics. That takes our mind away from our own troubles. So all our evidence-based relapse prevention tools, these are things that have been researched and supported by science in the past, so that a daily inventory prevents emotional buildup. Meditation calms the nervous system. Service activates purpose and meaning. Meaning is the opposite of addiction. Because in addiction, that is what was, I was still looking for meaning. Why am I doing this? What am I about? What will happen with me? No purpose and meaning to life, but when now you have structure, you have goals, you have a plan for your day. You have time to go and drink and waste time. Now I don't have time to go and waste time drinking. And I'm so happy when people don't invite me to their parties when they're drinking and all that, you know? Also, that fellowship and the power of connection, AA is not just steps, it is a community. AA groups are support groups where they not only meet and talk about addiction, they meet outside as well, and they go to the river and they plan activities and they have family day and they have all kinds of other activities to help the person in recovery to realize you don't have to be drinking to enjoy life. And it has been a long established fact that loneliness fuels addiction, connection heals it. Studies consistently show that peer support groups outperform isolated treatment. Helping others strengthens one's own recovery. And in AA itself, it says whenever everything else failed to keep a person in recovery, intensive work with other alcoholics never fail. In other words, in trying to help other alcoholics, you're really doing yourself the greatest favor. But you should not attempt to do that early in your recovery. You should do that with the help of a sponsor. So shared experience reduces shame. That's one of the hallmarks of AA. Because when you go to AA, a lot of people go thinking, boy, oh God, I've been really a bad, no good. And I've been told so by so many other people, thinking that only I in the world have done these bad things. And then you realize, when you listen to other people, you realize it's only human. When you're drinking, this is what happens. When you drink, you get drunk. And when you're drunk, you do foolishness. And it happens with so many other people. So you don't feel so badly about yourself. So that there's a AA slogan which says it best. We stay sober by helping others stay sober. That's how we stay sober. In other words, there's a slogan that they have on the wall, If you want, you have to give it away in order to keep it. By trying to help others, you are really keeping your sobriety. And this is not poetry. This is neuroscience in action. So that in conclusion today, I know time is running out, why AA still works. AA works because it treats addiction as a brain disorder. It recognizes it as a disease, not as a bad habit, not as a moral failing. It reduces ego and denial. It encourages honesty and emotional processing. It repairs social damage, provides lifelong peer support, and builds meaning, purpose, and hope. The language may be old, the principles are timeless, and the science now confirms that what AA discovered through lived experience many, many years ago, since 1935. So that recovery is not about willpower. It is about connection. It is about humility. It is about structure and service. So I want to thank you all for listening. If you or someone you love is struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction, know this, that recovery is possible and science agrees. Recovery is possible and science agrees. So if you like, you have any questions, you can text it to the number on your screen, or you can put it in the Facebook posting or the YouTube. And as I said earlier on, you can listen to this program tonight at 10 again. And I want to take this opportunity to wish Mr. Miraj a belated happy birthday and all that he wishes himself. I also want to thank Radio and TV Jagriti and the technical staff there for facilitating this program every week as a public service to all our brothers in Trinidad and Tobago and worldwide. And so until next week, Thursday, have a good week, have a sober week. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to call. Thank you very much.